who preached for me last week while I was out of town. 2 weeks ago, if you were here, I confessed to the church that I didn't know the rules to curling, and the church really responded, and quite a few of you sent me emails, messages about the rules, and I read them, and then I watched the gold medal match. If you didn't know, the men from this country won the gold medal in curling, and as I watched that game, and I know all the language now, I feel really cool, like ends and steals and hammers and all these terms, and I watched us win the gold medal, and I had this thought as I was watching. I kind of feel like they should write our church a thank you letter. Like, I'm not sure how that works, but I just feel like me learning the rules was part of their success. Well, hey, I'm glad you're here. Every once in a while in preaching, I will lean into a subject that's kind of a hot topic issue. So in the past, I've done several lessons on racism as that continues to divide our country. Last year, I did a sermon on politics. I waited a few months after the election because I didn't want to give anybody a heart attack. But I did talk a little bit about politics. And today, we're going to lean into one of those subjects that's fairly sensitive, and it's kind of a hot topic issue today. We're going to lean into the issue of workplace sexual harassment. If you'll put this picture on the screen, it's amazing. Since October, there's been well over 100 men in this country who have been accused of doing something inappropriate, and it's been odd to watch it all. It's happening so often. And one of the things I've been thinking is what exactly is the Christian response? How are Christians supposed to think when it comes to this really, really big issue? Now, a lot of what today is, it was about our Bible class that we had. If you're an adult, most of you got to be in that class. If you weren't in that class, man, it was fantastic. We had Lynn McMillan said a few things, Jeff McMillan said some great closing remarks, and then John DeSteiger interviewed three of our ladies, like Carrie Jane, Erica, and Amanda, about their experience on this issue, and it was really rich. And what I told First Service is that in First Service I said that my sermon is kind of like a warm-up band for the real act, and I was trying to think of what it would be in Second Service, and I couldn't come up with anything better than after you're already really full from a good meal and the server comes around and says, do you want key lime pie? And you really don't want it because you're already full, but you eat it anyway. That's what this sermon is. Like, we've already hit the high note, and I'll just share a few thoughts I have, but if you were in class, you received really, really good content, and so this will just kind of be a little bit of aftermath here. But I do want to be sensitive at the outset to all the audiences in the room. I'm very aware that there's a lot of ladies in the room that have some really negative experiences on this issue. It was quoted in Bible class that 80% of women at some point in their life will experience some form of harassment. And so a lot of you have stories that you could share. I'm also aware that there's men in the room that maybe you've had a story of harassment, or there might be men in the room where you've been accused of something, and so you hear all of this pretty differently. And then I'm also aware that there's kids in the room. My kids are in the room. And so parents, relax. I'm not going to be talking about anything that you're going to have to overly explain to your kids later. I'm going to step back and talk about some broad biblical principles that I do think help frame the discussion. In fact, in just a minute, we'll be in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2. I'm also aware that there are some people in the room thinking, why in the world are we talking about this? This is ridiculous. We don't need to be addressing this. This is not something you talk about in church. And to that line, I'm thinking, I would push back on that. I actually think that the church is the best place to have this discussion because our worldview as Christians, if you really read your Bible, we have a worldview that has a great version of how women really ought. If you really read your Last week when I was out of town, I spoke at a church near Searcy, Arkansas, the night before I stayed in Hot Springs. And I tried something I'd never tried before called Airbnb. Anybody know what Airbnb is? Okay, it's an app, and you can, through the app, rent places to stay, people's homes, that they might leave for the weekend, and they'll rent you out their room, or a room in their house, or they'll rent you out their whole house. Well, I decided to try that. I'd never done it before, probably never going to do it again. And on the app, I booked this house, and on the pictures, it just looks so nice on the app. And we get there, and what we now refer to it as with the four of us in my family is we call it the House of Terror. And we get there and the driveway is just, it's slanted, gravel, mud, there's junk all over the yard. The house is really just about a 900-foot shack. You walk inside, super smelly, carpets are really old, the blinds and the windows are all crinkled. I don't know why they've done this. There's not that many rooms in the house, but they've unscrewed light bulbs from the overhead, and so you walk in and flick the light switch and like nothing happens. Really dark, really creepy. Right next to this tiny 900-foot shack is this even smaller, I don't even know what it is, maybe a shed. And when we get there, I see children going in and out of this tiny little shed, and then I go into my house, and the pictures on the walls of my house do not match the kids running in and out of the shed. No parents at all. Like, I think I'm going to die. Like, it's like, this is a scene from a horror movie. This is not good. I'm not a paranoid person, or I don't think I am. But that night, I went like Kevin from Home Alone. I booby-trapped the doors. Like, I put objects in front of the doors. I put a coat rack in front of one door. I moved furniture in front of another door. Like, I was scared. In fact, before I went to bed, I was still like amped up. I was like, I don't have any weapons. And so they had like, I don't know, there's probably a word for this, but the fireplace poker that you poke the fire. I grabbed that and I put it right next to my bed and I slept there just in case someone came in. Now, why did I do all that? Aside from being a little paranoid. I did that because I want my wife and my daughters to flourish when they're in relationship with me. And that's the kind of world that the Bible actually imagines when it comes to how women should interact with this world. If you're a Christian, then you have adopted this worldview which says at the beginning of the Bible that women are created in the image of God. And you have a Savior, Jesus Christ, who walked into the world in a place and time where women were kind of second-class citizens, and they were treated more as possessions and objects. And Jesus comes into the world, and he calls them daughters. That's the kind of worldview that you have. You have adopted a worldview where you have a guy like the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy who says, you need to treat women like sisters with absolute purity. And so the reason we should be talking about this is because the Christian worldview actually has a lot to say about this current world mess that we are in. We should be leading the charge with a healthy view of what this might look like in the world. And so I want to ask two questions this morning. Number one, why is this happening? Why is this happening so much in the last 6 months? And number two, what's the proper Christian response to this whole situation? Question one, why is this happening so much in our culture today? I'll give it to you what I think is in one sentence, and then I'll explain a little further. But in one sentence, if I had to answer the question, why is this happening so much? Here's my answer. It's because we as a culture, and maybe particularly as men, but as a culture, I think we're having an affair with power. And I don't think anybody wants to admit it. I'll say it again. I think we're having an affair with power, but I don't think that anybody wants to admit it. Now, let me go to Scripture and explain what I'm talking about here. 1 Peter chapter 2 talks a lot about the cross, and I'm going to give you three different dimensions of the cross. And I want you to pay attention to how you react to these various dimensions. So, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, Peter says these beautiful words, by his wounds we are healed. So, on one level, the cross is salvation. And this is the one you're most familiar with. He paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away. And now I sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. This is the gospel story. You've committed sins, and you can't do anything to take those sins away. Jesus dies on the cross to pay the penalty for your sins. And when we're baptized, we meet that salvation in the water. The cross is salvation. And my guess is that when you hear that, generally you agree, and there's somewhat of a warmth within as you think about salvation. Secondly, Peter says this, chapter 1, verse 22, Jesus committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he didn't retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Second dimension of the cross is adoration. And what I mean by that is when you really meditate on what Jesus did, And maybe you're like me, when you take the Lord's Supper and really think about the agony of what Jesus went through for you, for me, I'm full of adoration when I really think about what Jesus did on the cross. He suffered for you. In fact, Peter goes on to say that. Christ suffered for you. You can hit that next verse on the screen. When I really think about that, I just can't help but think, thank you, praise you, God, for this. I'm struck by adoration because of what Jesus did for me on the cross. Now, my guess is when you hear that, you think, well, I generally agree, and generally that's a good thing. Here's the third dimension of the cross. Peter goes on to say, the next part of this sentence in 1 Peter chapter 2 is, Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Third dimension of the cross is invitation. So it's not that Jesus is just saying, I'm going to get up here and die for you. He's saying, I'm now going to invite you to actually live this kind of life. How do you feel about that dimension of the cross? To be completely honest, I don't like it at all. In fact, when I read passages like this in 1 Peter, my first reaction is to say, well, Peter's just writing to persecuted people, and we don't live in a persecuted country, and so these words really don't apply to us. We're not supposed to suffer with Jesus. We're not supposed to die with Jesus. That line of thinking doesn't really work out, because when you read your New Testament, the cross as invitation, it's everywhere. Galatians 2:20, Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ and no longer live, but Christ lives in me. That's cross as invitation. He says later in Philippians chapter 2 that your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ, who died on a cross. Jesus himself says in Luke chapter 9, he says, if anybody wants to follow me, you got to take up your cross every single day. You got to follow me. So this idea that the cross as invitation is just for one group of people, it was just the persecuted Christians back then, for every believer. In a sense, what the Bible's saying, what Jesus is saying, is that Jesus lived his life in such a way where he gave up his rights, he gave up his power, he kept living this life of submission and suffering, and then he invited other people to do the same thing. The cross, it was not just a gift for your soul. The cross, it is a paradigm for life. And so Jesus didn't just die to save you from your sins. Jesus died so that you could try to live that same kind of way. So on one level, yes, the cross is a story that saves. And on a different level, yes, the cross is a story of which we can adore. Cross it's an invitation to live life that way. And again, to be honest, I don't like that. I don't want to live my life that way. In fact, the way I feel about cross as invitation is the same way that I feel about door-to-door vacuum salesman. A few years ago, I'm sitting at home, doorbell rings, I answer the door. These people say, hey, we got this vacuum. We'd like to give you a demonstration. Would you mind if we vacuumed and shampooed your entire living room? All you got to do is sit through the presentation. I said, sure, why not? Invited these people in. I sat on my love seat, or I sat on my recliner, and I just watched SportsCenter for an hour while they just shampooed the carpet. Room smelled great, and they were talking to me the whole time. At one point, they had me pull out my vacuum cleaner just so they could show me how terrible my vacuum cleaner was. And really, I don't remember the brand of their vacuum cleaner, but I mean, it seemed like something that NASA made. I mean, it was like, it's got the suction power of a spaceship, and it was really a nice vacuum cleaner. Well, at the very end, I remember they said, do you like our vacuum? I said, absolutely. And then they said, do you want to buy our vacuum? And I said, absolutely not. I'm going to keep my $1,000. You can get out of my house. Now, why did I say that? It's because I wanted the vacuum cleaner to clean my dirt. But the vacuum cleaner costs too much to make it part of my life. There's a lot of us, that's how we think about the cross. I like the cross to clean my dirt and to clean my sin and to clean my junk. But man, you know what? It just costs a little too much to make it part of my life. You see, the reason that a lot of us react negatively to the invitation of the cross is because we're having an affair with power, and we don't want to admit it. My guess is sometime in the last few months you've said a prayer that sounds something like, "Dear God, thank you for sending your son to die on the cross to save me from my sins." But my guess is you've not prayed a prayer in the last few months that says this: "Dear God, thank you for sending your son Jesus to die on the cross to invite me up there with him." We don't pray that because we don't want that. And the reason we don't want that is actually the same reason why all these scandals have broke out in the last 6 months, is because we are addicted to power. And we're not even aware of how your everyday life. Just think about the things that you do in a given week. Why do you so desperately want to move up the career ladder, whatever your line of work is? Well, it's because of power. You think about why you get so much satisfaction from belittling someone behind their back. It's because of power. Why do you feel this deep need to always have the last word in a conversation, to always have other people think you're right? Well, it's power. Why do you feel insulted when people don't text you back as promptly as you wish that they would? Again, we are having an affair with many men in our culture, not just in the last 6 months, but for years, treated women as objects. Power. We're addicted to power. So what drives the headlines in our culture also lurks in the hearts of every single Christian. And question 2 is this: what are Christians supposed to do about this? What do we do in response to all the things that have been happening in our culture? I want to give you one word which I think can be really helpful. And the word is, it came into the English vernacular about 400 years ago. The word is cruciform, and it means in the shape of a cross. Everybody say the word cruciform. In the shape of a cross. Now, this word is actually in a lot of different disciplines. So biologists discovered this particular strand of DNA years ago that happened to be in the shape of a cross. And so they named this strand cruciform DNA. In the world of music, the word cruciform is used. In fact, Johann Sebastian Bach was trying to figure out a way to proclaim the gospel in the way he wrote notes. And so there's this, hit the next one. When you have 2 notes on the outside and then 2 notes on the inside that go above and below, you can form a cross. That's called cruciform musical notes. And Bach would write this into his music as a way to proclaim the gospel. The word cruciform has made its way into aviation. So when you see an airplane and you've got a cross on the end of the tail, they call that a cruciform cross or a cruciform tail. So all the word means is in the shape of a cross. Now, what many modern day authors are writing about is it possible for a person, a Christian, to actually live a cruciform life? Cruciform life. To be formed and shaped by the cross. Well, it's possible. It's pretty hard, but it's possible. And the reason it's possible is because someone actually did it. His name was Jesus. The cross didn't just define Jesus' death. The cross actually defined Jesus' life. Jesus' entire life was shaped by this idea of cruciformity. I mean, think about it. Every time in Jesus' life where power wanted to rear its ugly head, Jesus said, "No, I'm not going to obey power." Power would have said heaven, but Jesus said, "No, we'll go with earth." And power would have said, "Let's be born in Jerusalem." No, we'll go Bethlehem. Power would have said, "Hey, let's be a person of royalty and let's have riches." Jesus says, "No, I'll be poor. I'll be a peasant." Power would have said mansion. Jesus says manger. Power would have said, "Let's have a nice home." Jesus says homeless. At every chapter of this homeless, Bethlehem. We'll go. It's incredible. Jesus lived this life of the most radical, audacious critique against power that has ever been lived in the history of the world, and he's God. And then he looks at you and me and he says, I want you to live that same kind of life. Follow me. Let me ask you a few questions about your life. Think about cruciformity in your world. So throw this first question up on the screen. Is your career cruciform? Like the way that you're trending and the positions that you're seeking, is your career in the shape of a cross? What about your social life? Number two, what about your finances? Are your finances cruciform? Are they in the shape of a cross? What about your social life? Who are your friends? But more importantly, why are they your friends? Do you only hang out with the people that are going to move you up the ladder, or do you intentionally seek people that maybe are below you on the, or do you intentionally... Psychologists have recently coined this term. I read about it in a newspaper in a hotel room a few months ago, but I love this phrase, conversational narcissism. And a lot of us are guilty of that. What conversational narcissism is, it's the inability to turn a conversation to somebody else. It's like the black hole of conversation. You always suck back things into yourself. Is your conversational life in the shape of a cross? Can you put the conversation in somebody else's world and just sit there for a while? For those of you who are married, is your marriage cruciform? Are you operating by the narrative of power? Or are you operating by the narrative of love and submission when it comes to your marriage? I was having a conversation with one of the ladies in our church the other day, and she said something. It was really simple, like it wasn't a big deal, but it's actually, this is an example of cruciformity in marriage. Her husband was kind of being frustrating, and so she told me this. She says, there are certain things that he does that annoy me, but for the most part, I actually try to keep those thoughts in my head. Again, really simple thing, not a big deal, but that's cruciformity. And the reason I was talking to this person is because she's my wife. Mary was saying this about me. Yes, there are things that I do that really frustrate her, and she doesn't like it. But you know what? She keeps a lot of those thoughts in her head because she's practicing cruciformity. It's actually a pretty big deal. You might think about what your marriage would look like if when you got frustrated, you kept a lot of those thoughts in your head. Here's the big application question, though. And I'll start with men. Men, is your relationship to women cruciform? Think about your friends, think about your coworkers, or even in the context of fathers, daughters, nieces, granddaughters. Is your relationship with the women in your life cruciform? Here's three really practical things that you can write down. Number one, men, pay attention to the way you talk about women. What we say about these stories are making it in public is important that we call each other out behind the scenes, whether call the reason all these, and so even if no one ever behind their backs, true about the way you talk to women. I'm not saying don't talk to women the way you talk to women. To have good, healthy conversations with them, but just pay attention to what you're saying to them. Have good. You're using words like honey or sugar or darling. Not so sure if you want to say those words. Those are pet names, and she's not your pet. And so just pay attention. Pay attention to the words you're saying to women. And then third is this. Just pay attention to where power is. Where's the power? Maybe you're in a meeting at work, and just pay attention. Who has the positional power? Who has the relational power? Where is power falling in the room? Where is it falling in the classroom? Where is it falling in your family? And when you discover and you think, and when you discover and you think woman how she's feeling, pay attention to the power. And then let me flip the coin real quick, and I'll say one word. Say that I've got two daughters that I love more than say that. told me that. But I've been preaching here for 6 years now, and I couldn't agree with him more. The reason this church is such a great church is because we've got some incredible, and I couldn't agree. Have had something happen in your past is because I would say to you, just as a preacher who cares about you, in your life. And I know that there's a lot of ladies that things have happened in your past and you don't know what to do with that. You don't know how to deal with that. You carry that around. Maybe you feel guilty or you feel shame because of something that happened. And my encouragement to you would be to find someone you trust and interrogate the shame. Why is it there? Where did it come from? What would Jesus have to say about that shame? There's nothing that anyone can do to you that can change Christ's affection for you. Last thing I'll say to all of us is this: your daily decisions will ultimately determine your long-term legacy. So all the decisions that you make every day that you think are pretty inconsequential and this isn't going to matter, and my conversation with this person is not going to really matter, and what I tweet today is not really going to matter, they add up. And so the decisions that you make every single day eventually add up, and then you've got a legacy. And we got to be really careful about how we're handling this issue, because generations from now, people are going to talk about this time and how we as Christians responded to this really, really big issue in our day. In fact, in honor of Black History Month, I'll tell you this story that I read recently. It was pretty powerful. In the 1960s, in the city of Laurel, Mississippi, racial tensions were really, really high. And there was a preacher named Bob Marsh, really influential preacher in his town. Everybody loved Bob. And deep in his heart, he did not believe in segregation. Thought it was terrible. But in his city also lived a guy named Sam Bauer. Sam Bauer was one of the top leaders in the KKK movement. And so Bob Marsh was in this strange position because he wanted to speak out against segregation, but he knew if he did, he might be in danger, his family might be in danger. This was the South, and people were really embracing Sam Bauer in his city. So he was in a tough spot. But he knew that if he sided with Sam Bauer, he would alienate all these African-American brothers and sisters that he really, really cared about, and so he was stuck. Well, he finally made a decision. And he chose to live the path of acquiescence. His sermon was titled "The Sorrow of Selma." And he stood up in front of his church, and he told all his people to stop going to civil rights marches. And infamous, that all you need to do is come to church out there. Do you know the reason we out there? Wrote this book basically saying, Dad, what were you thinking? Why would you do this? You see, his son was just a kid growing up, but he remembers everything that happened. And so the truth is, one of these days, our kids, our grandkids, our great-grandkids are going to write stories about how we handled the issues of our day. And so the big question is, are we going to handle this in a cruciform way, the way of the cross? Final question I want you to think about. What area of your life needs to be a little more cruciform? Where are you really addicted to power? You don't want to admit it. Where is that place? Own it. Name it. Because here's the great irony of cruciformity. Jesus just kept going down and down and down. He goes from heaven to earth, and then he goes to a cross and he dies. Everybody thought he was crazy. Why would you do this? Who are you? And then somehow in the depths of the grave, we find the power of resurrection. It's actually the great irony of the entire Christian story that as we submit ourselves and as we go lower and lower and lower and humble ourselves before God and lift those around us up, somewhere in the middle of radical humility is the power of the resurrection. And so it doesn't seem normal to submit and to lower yourself, but I'm telling you, the only way you can experience the love of Christ, the power of Christ, is actually by giving up power. Doesn't make any sense, but it's the way the Christian story works. The invitation of the cross, it's still available. It's not an easy way of life, but it's the best way to meet God. If there is something going on in your life and your heart stirring right now, man, first service we had a guy come down. He was like, this was for me. He's been addicted to power and he wanted to get his life right. If there's something going on in your life, you want to tell us about it, you want prayers, you want to get baptized, come tell me about it while we stand and sing.